I think chronic illness grief is one of the most underappreciated and under-recognized forms or types of grief. And today I'm going to share with you why I think it's so complex. When you live with a chronic illness, as I have for the past 10, 12 years almost, one of the things I've realized is that it's so different from any other form of grief. And today I want to talk a little bit about why it tends to be more complicated grief. There are so many ways that we grieve and experience loss when living with a chronic illness. And these types of losses are often numerous, diverse, and persistent. We are persistently reminded of these losses in a way that other forms of grief, I don't think, experience them. The other thing is, depending on your illness, sometimes it can be very confusing because with other types of grief and loss, for example, there's a very clear, this was lost and I'm never getting it back. Whereas when you have chronic illness, sometimes it cycles in a way where you do get some things back and then you lose them all over again. And then you do get them back and then you lose them all over again. Some of the things that we lose or can grieve when you live with a chronic illness are things like your abilities. If you used to be able to do something and now you can't do that in the same way or you can't do it at all, that's one thing that we grieve. Number two, we lose our sense of identity because our identity is very much wrapped up in the things that we can do, how we do them, the plans we have for ourselves, our relationships and how we engage with them, etc., etc. So we lose our sense of identity. The other thing we tend to lose is relationships. Believe it or not, many people living with chronic illness lose a lot of their relationships because people are either A, not patient with them, B, they don't understand chronic illness, especially if you're in this place where you haven't been diagnosed yet and don't have a clear explanation for why you can't show up to things or, why you're not able to attend to the relationship in the same way. And so people kind of gradually thin themselves out and disappear from your life. The other thing we grieve, which I think a lot of people don't realize, is changes to our body and our ability to have any sort of control over our bodily functions. Sometimes we grieve the loss of simple things like being able to eat foods that you like that you can't eat anymore. Being able to use the bathroom in the way that most people do. Being able to sleep. Being able to, be outside. Some people can't be in the sun. There's so many different small nuanced things that actually are really big to the people who experience them and can't do them anymore. And a lot of people might think, oh, that's not a big deal, but it is. Some of the other things we grieve the losses over are pretty big in the grand scale of our lives, like the loss of a career that you're no longer able to do that maybe you spent your whole life training for, or the loss of the dream of being able to go to college if you get sick as a young person, the loss of being able to have kids if that was something that you wanted to do and now you no longer can do that. I think one of the biggest reasons that grief is so underestimated with chronic illness is we underestimated ourselves because we're constantly fighting this barrage of symptoms and doctor's appointments and treatments. And so we don't necessarily have the time or energy to attend to those feelings or even recognize them for what they are. And so we often just don't. I think this is also compounded by the kind of aftershock of that, right? When you grieve, let's say, the loss of someone in your life, where there's a clear moment in time when that person was no longer there, you have no choice but to find ways to move on with your life without them there. And you have opportunities to recreate that life in a kind of cohesive way, though it is still painful and like you're not going to get them back, right? With chronic illness, there isn't that. It is so infinite, the number of losses that we experience. It is recurring, and part of the nature of the loss is due to this internal thing we experience that we can't move away from or escape from or move on from. It's always there, and it's always kind of this unpredictable thing that we have to deal with. And so a lot of the ways that we cope from loss, like what I was referencing before, is we'll get out and try to do the things that we used to do. And we kind of find ways to move forward, carrying that loss with us while we are engaging in these activities. When you have a chronic illness, you can't do that necessarily. You don't have the same things, the same tools, the same activities, hobbies, constants in your life to ground you. Nothing grounds you. And so it can be really hard to find meaning from loss, which brings up this sort of existential grief. And it can be really hard to find ways to even process or recognize grief because you're so caught up in, this chronic illness that a lot of times does dominate our day-to-day life. The other thing is with the finality of death, let's say from the loss of a loved one, often brings closure. When you have chronic illness, a lot of times you don't get that closure. You don't get that finality because a lot of the nature of chronic illness is unpredictable, ever-changing, evolving, ups and downs, etc. And with the finality, I think even though humans really don't, they're not necessarily skilled in supporting people who are grieving, even from the death of a loved one, but they can still recognize that you're grieving, right? Where even if it's temporary and it's not perfect and it's messy, when you have a chronic illness, nobody recognizes you're grieving, and they often have this very limited capacity for compassion with a chronic illness. And so I think without that emotional support, and the fact that a lot of times we lose our social supports throughout the process of being sick, you not only don't have that closure, but you also don't have the supports you might need to help you get through grieving the losses of chronic illness and learning how to recreate an identity that encapsulates that. I think there's a lot of overlap in grief and the types of trauma that we experience related to our health issues and our illness experience. And so I think for a lot of these reasons, when it goes unsupported, we end up having, more complicated depression, anxiety, fear about the future, feelings of loneliness and hopelessness. And so this is where I encourage people to reach out to a therapist who supports people with these types of unique challenges found in living with a chronic illness.